Okay, so if you like the tightly scripted videos or the videos with a lot of amusing images or something, this one probably won't be for you. What I've found over the years is that sometimes the videos are a little bit more off the cuff. It's not to say not thought about and sketched out in my mind, but not laid out and heavily planned or particularly complicated. Sometimes they're the more compelling ones. They're usually the longer ones. So at the very least, get yourself a drink. But this is going to be one of those videos that you can listen to, you don't actually have to watch, which is obviously an advantage when I'm on screen most of the time. So what had happened was, this is going to be a video response to a comment, and I've narrowed it down to 7 different points. The first point is the longest, so don't worry about how long that takes. To get there then, what had happened was, Friended had made a video entitled, "Am I stupid? Please help with my Noel Plum Respose." I think that was supposed to say response video, and he squirreled that away on his Think Club channel. And what he was saying is, hey, Noel Plum had made this response. In fact, what had actually started was he'd made another one of his sort of polemics against anti-theists, and I'd responded quite quickly. I didn't have the luxury of the time that I have today. I made a very quick response to him, and he'd watched that, and at least according to him, he'd sort of had one of these "what the fuck was that all about" moments, which was interesting actually, because not many people in my comment section seem to have had quite so much difficulty in understanding it, but he'd had some difficulty in understanding what I'd said. I can kind of see from his perspective why he may have had more difficulty in parsing what I was saying, in terms of what I understand him to believe than some other people would. So I don't want to seem too cynical on that point. But what is interesting is, often when you go into these discussions with people, because of course I've had a hangout debate with Friended on this. This is not new ground. A lot of this is that you go into these things with preconceptions about what the argument is about, and that it's going to be over certain facts, or what particular group of facts are going to be relevant, and that's what the argument's going to be about. Okay, either the specifics of the putting the numbers on the particular facts, or whether this basket of facts is what is more important, or this basket of facts. And then when you start to have it, what you find is that the discussion stemmed from a position where you took a set of things A as sort of axiomatic, and that the conversation is going to be about another set of things B. And then you realise down the line that actually some of those things that you placed in A you shouldn't have done. That involves a series of misconceptions and misunderstandings about what the other person believes, or what their foundations are. That you assume that you're both taking the same things for granted, or in some cases you think the other person isn't taking something for granted when in fact they were. And so these things become uncovered. And happily, as a result of some of the comments that I'd left on this video, "Am I stupid? Please help with my Noel Plum Respose video," Friended left a comment saying, "Okay, I'm not saying I agree with your position now, but I think I'm getting now the points that you're making." So maybe there's some forward movement there. It does feel like some definite forward movement on some of that. So what had happened was a chap called Ground Floor Guthrie. I say he's called Ground Floor Guthrie. I doubt that's his real name, to be honest with you. But we're going to call him Ground Floor Guthrie. That's his YouTube username. He left a comment, and I wanted to respond to part of that. And the reason that I want to respond to part of that is because he asks some interesting questions that are interesting to talk about on their own, but also because they cover some of the ground that I talked about in some of these comments that I'd left elsewhere in the comment section. Allow me to expand on that and to say it to more people than are going to be involved in the comment section of of Friended's Think Club channel. So what had happened was, Ground Floor Guthrie left a first comment that rubbed me up the wrong way a little bit, and I'll just read you a little bit of that. He's talking about me. He says, "Thing is, I believe he's falling prey to the very thing he's claiming wouldn't happen to a rational person. Most atheists are what a friend of mine called explicit atheists. An explicit atheist is one who typically has a negative emotional reaction against religion whenever it is encountered. This, of course, is the gut reaction you mentioned. He's talking to Friended there. But this fact is ignored by the atheist in question because he has science and rationality to back up his decision that there is no God, and also religion is a force of evil in the world. Even when I was very religious myself, I knew this for what it was. I knew that God question is almost always an irrational one, no matter the outcome, and that such a person likely had a negative experience with a religious group, personal group, which just so happens to be informing his atheism. As an aside, such folks were usually much easier to convert to Christianity than others who may not believe but didn't care about such things so much. He doesn't seem to consider the possibility that rationality and irrationality can coexist within an individual, that rationality will just win because, if pressed, I wonder who would do the hand waving. Okay, so I took exception to his comment and I told him that. And the bit that I singled on was the last bit, in fact, this idea that I don't seem to consider the possibility that rationality and irrationality can coexist within an individual. Because that's not true, but also because I just addressed that actually in another comment response to somebody else. So I said, actually, this is something that I think is fundamental and is critical to this discussion that we're having, that these things can and do coexist within people. But I also took exception to some of the other things because it just didn't describe me. In fact, many of it was ridiculous how wide of the mark in terms of growing up in an environment which was almost entirely non-religious, and so not having any of these negative experiences of religious people or groups. You know, I probably had less overtly negative experiences of religious people or groups than 99% of people in the world. So a lot of this really it was tripe. It applies to some people, but it just didn't apply to me. So I said this, and I got a response from him apologising for some of his, which he admitted was guesswork. But he asked me a series of questions, and I responded to say, look, these are good questions. Way more than I can respond in a comment, so let me set them out properly. So that's what I'm going to do now. So let me read you the first question. I will edit this video enough just to put these questions up on screen afterwards, because I know that just listening to the question often is a little bit confusing, so I will throw them up. This was the first one. Drudenfusz did have one presumption that perhaps went too far. Drudenfusz had left another comment. You don't need to know what it is for the basis of this. So I'll ask, do you think it's possible for humans to be completely rational? Meaning humans who are able through reason or whatever to rid themselves of irrationality. If so, what would that look like? Are there any examples, individual or societal, I think that should be society, that can be pointed to? If not, what are we contending over? In your above response to me, you create a metaphor of religion as a cloak draping over human irrationality. How is this metaphor different from the one I pointed to when I spoke of enlightenment? Isn't it the same thing? Again, is it possible that we're arguing on the same side here? So these are two questions, but I want to tackle them both together. First, let me just point out that I didn't mention a cloak draping over human irrationality. I mentioned religion as a cloak draping over human rationality, not human irrationality. What I said is that it's sometimes portrayed as if it's a cloak, a veneer over irrationality, and if you removed that veneer, all you would expose is the foundational irrationality. Nothing would change. And I said I don't think that's always the case. I think in some ways it's like a little cluster of irrationality in another otherwise rational individual. So what it asked me then is, are there some people, or could there be some people that are completely rational? What would that look like? So what I wanted to do is to outline it, and this is the one note that I have made just to make sure that I cover the bits that I want to say here. In terms of whether you could have a completely rational person, I suppose you'd be looking at a kind of Mr. Spock kind of individual, which sums it up, doesn't it? So the question isn't just whether you could have a fully sort of dispassionate rational individual, but whether a fully rational, perfectly rational individual would be a functional human being, or would it actually be a sort of psychopathy? And it probably would, wouldn't it? I don't think you could function like that. I think there's good reason to believe that. And I think there are certain spheres of our life, you know, in a private life, in our love interests, etc., where you particularly wouldn't want to function on a purely rational level. Are emotions rational? Is ignoring your emotions rational? There are lots of questions that are almost paradoxical here. It's almost like saying, is there a perfect person, but then accepting that somebody who was perfect would be kind of annoying and that you'd kind of like some imperfections. And so you end up with a paradoxical situation where a perfect person is less perfect than a person that's got imperfections. But if you've got imperfections, then you can't be perfect. And it's maybe the same thing here, in as much as certainly if you were to ask a perfectly rational person whether they'd like to be perfectly rational, or would they be a more functional person if they weren't perfectly rational, I think the rational answer would be no. I need some degree of irrationality, some degree of emotional commitment, of gut feeling in there to be a functional person. So the rational decision that a perfectly rational person would make would be not to be a rational person. I don't think we're talking about perfectly rational people, right? What we're talking about really is something a little bit more parochial. It's rationality in certain spheres that impact upon public policy, that impact upon social scenarios that are affecting other people. That's where we want people to be rational. We don't want society to be. We don't want people to make decisions that affect everybody based on irrational impulses that are particular to them and only really apply to them, I think, is one of the things. And certainly when it comes to science, we would like people to be rational, I think. I think that really what we're talking about here as well, and this is part of when I talk about how as this conversation has developed, we're maybe getting down a little bit to the foundational disagreements here, which is that it's easy for this discussion to start to talk about people as rational and irrational. But that's not the case. It's not a case that you've got these people that are wholly rational and these people that are irrational, and the irrational ones become religious and the rational ones don't, or something along those lines, right? It just doesn't work like that. The people's rationality as adults, as fully fleshed out people, as the finished article, if you like, exists along a spectrum, and in many ways is probably clustered more towards the middle point than it is towards these endpoints in some kind of polarized dichotomy. You know, it's more of a sort of normal distribution clustered around the middle. But that's only one axis. We also have perhaps another axis, which is people's susceptibility to irrationality. And whereas looking at how rational people are, it's perhaps more in the sphere, the domain of adulthood, people's susceptibility is maybe more important when we're looking at children. It's critical, I think, when we're looking at children. Because we can talk about confirmation bias, but to have a confirmation bias, you have to have something to be biased towards in the first place. It draws me back to something I'll never forget. It was a series that Richard Dawkins was hosting that was on the BBC, and he's talking to these school children about creationism. And he sat at his desk chatting with this child who's a creationist, and the sort of camera cuts in and he's been giving this child some of the evidence for evolution. And Dawkins says to the child something along the lines of, so why don't you accept this evidence? And the child responds with the line, and paraphrasing again, because it contradicts what I believe. And so Dawkins says to him, and this is the key line here, he says, so you're choosing what to believe not on the basis of the evidence, but on the basis of the version of events that you heard first. Right, because that's true, isn't it? Effectively, the child is picking creationism over evolution because that's the version of events. That's the belief that he heard first. And of course, that's the basis for confirmation bias. But you can't have confirmation bias over something like creation versus evolution until you've been taught one of them in the first place. And so this whole business of susceptibility is quite important. And I think that children are particularly susceptible. Children will soak up all kinds of ideas, whether they're right or wrong. And this was one of the points that I was making to Friended with regard to religion and it being a generational thing. We're not talking about changing people's minds, adults' minds, because you aren't really going to do that. It's not going to make the damnedest bit of fucking difference, quite honestly. But children are a different matter. And you can talk about intuitionism and all this kind of thing when you're talking about adults and making decisions, making judgments based on gut feeling and intuition, and then the rationale coming afterwards. But a lot of those intuitions with the things that religion is touching upon in society, those intuitions exist because of learning that you've had at a younger age. And this is something that Haidt himself accepts. Right, he says this in this book, that children will accept these different things, that there are these basic innate tendencies, ideas of fairness and all these kinds of things, but then how that is applied is very much dependent upon what you learn in your culture, and that is why when you look at different cultures, you get different sets of results. But even in adults, as well as this spectrum of more rational to less rational, we know that you have a spectrum of susceptibility as well. So you will have some adults, we all know of them, don't we, who, with things like medicine, they're perfectly rational adults, and they will make rational decisions, based on the data. If a doctor presents them their options for treatments for something, they can make the same rational decision as you or I. But they're quite susceptible individuals, and they're only one book on homeopathy away, right, from medical irrationality, because they're quite easily swayed by these kinds of ideas. And we all know people that are like that. And so some people are more rational than others as adults. But even in amongst that, there are some people who purely by dint of what they've been exposed to may be rational, but are quite susceptible to irrationality. And you might have some people who actually are quite irrational, but are actually fairly robust against irrationality, that it's taken quite a lot of knocking into their heads at quite a young age to get them to where they are. So I think there's a real spectrum in terms of these two axes. But then I think there's another thing, which is that a comment had cropped up where the discussion was over religious people as irrational. And in fact, Friended had left a comment along those lines of religious people and irrationality tying together. And I immediately disagreed with that. And I said, I don't think that's right, because my experience is that actually a lot of people, religious people, are highly, highly rational people. And that is part of what frustrates me, is that the religious aspect is almost like, it's like a blind spot in their reasoning. And in otherwise, I'm not saying in every other aspect of their life, again, personal relationships, love life or whatever, they may have the same irrationalities that most of us have. But in terms of the sort of scientific functioning, these domains where science and things like that, where you would expect rationality to govern or have a much bigger say, that it's kind of a blind spot to them. So I wanted to mention 3 books, because I know I'm getting sort of misinterpreted in a lot of this, as sort of not appreciating these things. So these are 3 books that I've written in the past, I've read in the past, okay, that I want to tell you about. And this is the first one, The Great Partnership by Jonathan Sacks, who is the chief rabbi for the United Kingdom. This is probably a book that Friended would like, actually, this, because it's one of these books which is singing the praises of religion, even if God doesn't exist, from the chief rabbi, more in a sort of Jordan Peterson-esque way of truth value, even if they're untrue. It might not be literally true, but there are truths that you can uncover, and it will give your life meaning and all this kind of stuff. But this is a book which is trying to find a way for religion and science to function together, and in some ways Jonathan Sacks's attempt for himself, because he's a very clever man, and this is the point, he's a very rational man, but he has this religious belief, and when you read about some of his religious belief, to anybody who doesn't share his faith, I don't think it comes across as rational. The second book is Francis S. Collins, of course, who was head of the Human Genome Project, The Language of God. Again, another book from somebody, this guy, a Christian, trying to reconcile his scientific rational side with his faith. There's one line in here that I've bookmarked because I wanted to read it out. Here it is. Okay, he's talking about Adam and Eve. Very well, so the 6 days of creation, which he doesn't believe, he's not a young earth creationist, obviously, he's the fucking head of the Human Genome Project, can be harmonised with what science tells us about the natural world. But what about the Garden of Eden? Is the description of Adam's creation from the dust of the earth and the subsequent creation of Eve from one of Adam's ribs so powerfully described in Genesis 2... I'm gonna swap these round a bit because it makes more sense in terms of what I'm going to say. Intended as a literal history or as a symbolic allegory of the entrance of the human soul into a previously soulless animal kingdom. Well, in terms of the order I've read it out in, obviously for Francis S. Collins, it's the latter, that Adam and Eve is an allegory. Just let me read that out again. Listen to what he's saying. For the entrance of the human soul into a previously soulless animal kingdom. So, despite all his scientific perspective, he believes that at some point in human history, right, since our most recent common ancestor, that God has imbued us with an immaterial, immortal soul of the kind of which that you could judge and punish, of course, pass judgment on and punish. So it's not just some kind of observer, because you couldn't hold an observer culpable. It has some control over our material actions and so can be held culpable for them. It has responsibility because it has duties within us. I don't think that that's a rational position alone, but that's his position. Okay, a very rational guy, but if you read the book with these irrational thoughts. Then we have Kenneth R. Miller, Finding Darwin's God. A book that I would recommend, actually, if you know anybody who is religious, who's a Christian, particularly, a Catholic especially, who is somewhat sceptical of evolution, that's a book to get. And because Ken Miller is a Catholic, and the first 2/3 of this book are not just him discussing his science, but they are him doing a wonderful job of providing the evidence for the modern evolutionary synthesis. The last third of the book is Ken Miller trying to reconcile it with his Catholicism. And honestly, if you read this book, it kind of reads, a TLDR version of this book would be science, 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 science. Really, because that is effectively what it is. It just descends into mush. I think even if I was a religious person, I'd be somewhat depressed reading the final third of that book. And to give you an example of what I mean there, I don't know if I mentioned this in my hangout with Friended, but it's relevant, which was that as a result of reading that book and also thinking back to what Francis Collins had said with the entrance to the human soul, and a video that I'd made a couple of years before that called I Know You Haven't Got Soul, which provided what I thought was I couldn't find another video like it. It provided every form of evidence that I could find that appealed to me as to why we don't have an immaterial, immortal soul that survives our death. I emailed Ken Miller and I got involved in an email exchange with him. A short email exchange. I had 3 emails, 3 responses of him, but he was kind enough to indulge me and respond to me. And what I asked him, I said I'd read his book, and I said I found it all very compelling reading. Wonderful case for evolution. I'd recommend his book, blah, blah, blah. But I didn't, something that I hoped he'd tackle was the existence of the kind of immaterial immortal soul that he has to accept as part of his religion, otherwise none of it can function, none of it can make sense. Catholicism is dysfunctional without it. And so I said, I've got a couple of questions and I want to know how you reconcile them. I said, the first is that you have a series of apes which are fully functional, and their brain is providing the full array of functions, okay? And what you are going to do is you are going to imbue somewhere down the line that ape lineage with a soul that is going to be performing some of the functions that previously the material brain was performing. I said to him, I don't need to outline for you what the issues with that are. You've now got 2 pilots. You've got effectively a drone that was flying itself, and now you've got a pilot there that's trying to wrest the controls. That's a recipe for disaster, for huge internal conflict. I said, where is the evidence for the huge rewiring of the brain and reconfiguration of the brain that would be necessary at this point of ensoulment? And that's in the phenotype. Where's the differences in the phenotype? Where's the differences in the genotype that should lead to these necessary differences in the phenotype? That was the first question that I asked him. And the second question, as I said, that when we look at the brains of human beings, they appear to be more complex than the brains of chimpanzees, than the brains of dogs, which is what we would expect if our brains were doing more than the brains of chimpanzees and the brains of dogs. But clearly, if we have this soul that's providing all these functions that a chimp's brain and a dog's brain isn't, that they're effectively automatons and the brains are doing all the work, then we need quite a rudimentary brain in some ways, because our brains are doing less than probably any other mammal. I don't see the evidence for that. So how are you reconciling the fact that we have this super complex brain that looks like the kind of brain you would have without a soul, with the existence of a soul? How do you reconcile not being able to find any evidence of the changes that would be required to the hominin brain at the introduction of the soul? And the response that I got from him was disappointing, but it's a response that I knew that I was going to get. And I don't want to discuss the fact that it's disappointing, because in this video the point is of how enlightening it was. What he said is, I haven't reconciled them because I've never tried to reconcile them. Because one of them is a scientific position which I hold, and the other one is a faith position which I hold, and I don't try and reconcile my science with my faith. I keep them strictly apart. Now, you might find that somewhat unacceptable. I do, personally. But that's what he does. He compartmentalizes it. He is quite explicit about that, right? More explicit than almost anybody that I've heard. Very honest and upfront about that. But this is the thing. These are 3 people, Jonathan Sacks, Francis S. Collins, and Ken Miller, that are very, very intelligent individuals, very rational individuals, ultra-rational, scientific, clever people. But they have this area of irrationality. Ken Miller is explicitly clear about it, that it's an area of irrationality, and says, yeah, so I keep it entirely separate. It's a pretty fucking hard sell to tell me that if these people were not religious, if they had not been exposed to religion at a young age, that if they hadn't been exposed to religious ideas, that they would still have this sort of this black hole, this little region within their thinking where you would expect rationality to be a feature. These are issues where you would expect rationality to figure. It makes sense. These are not just emotional issues of the heart, such as how you feel about the person that you love, right? But they're lost to rationality. So this is how I view it. I don't view it that religious people are just functionally irrational people and that's why they're religious. No. Quite the opposite in many ways. That religious people are often very, very rational people. And still functionally rational, like these people, like these three guys. In 90% of the areas over which you would expect them to be rational, they are ruthlessly, rigidly, famously rational. But they have this little blind spot, and the blind spot is caused by religion. And like I say, you've got a really fucking hard time getting me to believe that if you take the religion out of the equation there, they're still going to have that same blind spot. That's bollocks that you're selling me if you're trying to sell me that. So I hope that answers that question there. Okay, when I say that religion is sort of like a cloak draping over human rationality. And so, of course, on this spectrum of people who are more or less susceptible, the more religion that you have in society, the more people are going to get drawn into that. The more people who otherwise may have only been exposed to more rational modes of thinking get drawn in to faith positions, get drawn into the idea that accepting something on faith is a valid way of doing it, and then not questioning it afterwards, or questioning it but not really questioning whether it's actually just, you're still going to believe it. You might ask questions superficially and have some kind of doubt, but ultimately it's an issue of faith. It's a level of belief that is greater than that which the evidence supports. So I hope that answers that first one. The second one, let's change I did say that was the longest. The second one, let's change the metaphor for a moment. Is it possible that you are viewing religion as an engine, if you will, powering a positive feedback loop for irrationality? That it is both the result of and catalyst for irrationality? If that's the case, then I think we are certainly arguing on the same side, using different ends of the drive train. So do I think that religion can be both the result of and a catalyst for irrationality? Yeah. As a cause for the result of irrationality, I accept that humans have an innately irrational disposition. Not entirely irrational, but we have that feature to us, which varies from individual to individual on a spectrum. But we have that capacity for irrationality, that susceptibility, that propensity for irrationality. And I think that leads spontaneously to religions arising and some aspects of religions relying upon that propensity and susceptibility for irrationality. Yes, we still might have, if we were thoroughly rational, we still might have some things that would be, you could describe them as religious in some ways, but they wouldn't have many of the characteristics that we see in what we usually regard as religions. So we might have some aspects of what we regard as religious thinking, but we wouldn't have what we would regard as religions. But what about as a catalyst for irrationality? Well, very much so, because like I say, there are people that have different degrees of susceptibility. Children have a very high degree of susceptibility. So if you take a young child and you tell them how to look at things scientifically and how to apply that way of reasoning, they will apply that. And they will apply that over all scientific fields, as I do, because that's all I was ever taught. But if you take a child and tell them that, but then tell them that there are some subjects, such as the origin of humans, right, or geology, where no, it just says this in the Bible, and if it says this in the Bible because the Word of God is the literal truth and you believe that above everything else, you prioritize that above everything else, and if the science is in conflict with that, then abandon all those reasoning models that we had, all those ways of looking and analysing things, abandon them. then you're going to increase the amount of irrationality that results, aren't you? Quite clearly that is the case, and quite clearly that was happening in those children that Dawkins had talked to. Quite clearly that is what is happening with regard to people like Ken Miller and Jonathan Sacks in some ways. So yeah, I think it does form as a catalyst. That's not to say that it's ultimately the cause of all irrationality. If you remove religion, irrationality would disappear. Of course it wouldn't. But if people are susceptible to things, if people are susceptible to ideas, the more that those ideas proliferate and the more that they're sold them, and the more that they're sold them when they're young, particularly, then the greater the uptake there will be of those irrational ideas. Third one, do you agree or disagree with Drudenfusz's assessment that the discussion here isn't over the percentages of rational versus irrational individuals, but rather a discussion of degree? Well, I've already agreed with that. It isn't a case of rational and irrational individuals. It's a spectrum, probably with most people somewhere in the middle there. But also a degree of susceptibility, and also a regionalism within the domain of your thought space, where you can be rational in a great deal of it, but irrational over particular things. And that's what religion is particularly great at doing, taking somebody who is generally rational over the broader domain of things that science impinges over, but putting a little black hole in there that sucks all the rationality away. Would you agree or disagree with my original post implication that there are explicit or implicit atheists? If you can agree with this, can you also agree that those who are more explicit can be viewed in much the same light as religious evangelicals? So I certainly think, I don't know about the explicit implicit thing, I don't know about the labelling, but there clearly are people that are evangelical in their atheistic beliefs, and often it's an interesting thing. It's the people that were most evangelical about their religious beliefs who then lose their religion. You know, how often do you see this? I used to be an atheist. You know, I went through an atheist phase, and there'll be somebody, how many Christians tell you that on YouTube, that they used to be an atheist? But it almost always turns out that they're from a very, very religious upbringing and then went through a sort of atheist phase, and now they're very religious again. And they were effectively a religious zealot, then they became an atheist zealot, and then they became a religious zealot again. It's the zealotry that remains. It's sort of like Paul of Tarsus, who was very zealous and is anti, if you believe the stories, the narratives in the Bible, he was very zealous, and given that he wrote a lot of them himself, it's probably true in his case. He was an anti-Christian zealot, and then he became a pro-Christian zealot. His beliefs changed, but the zealotry remained effectively with him. And I think that happens a lot with people, is that people who are very, very devout and evangelical in their religious beliefs, if they lose those religious beliefs, the evangelical trait remains. And some people maybe never had that religious trait, but they still have that sort of evangelical trait to the way that they think and act. So I think it's maybe kind of hard for some people to lose that. Maybe I have it to some degree, but it's not based, if I have it, it's not based on some kind of experience. It's based on simply the fact that these are issues that I'm interested in. Right, I'm not really that interested in converting anybody away from their religious beliefs. I couldn't really give a crap in those terms. We're already winning. We're winning the war in the UK. We're winning the war generationally, cohort on cohort. It's not through convincing people that God doesn't exist. It's because every generation is substantially less religious than the previous generation, and I can tell you that that's going to happen with the next couple of the next couple of cohorts that go through in any respect, and the older people that are going to die off the end of the most religious. And I could predict for you where the next couple of sets of stats will come out in 5 years, 10 years, 15 years and 20 years time, and it's all looking rosy as far as we can see on that. So I can sit here as smug as fuck with regard to all of that. I've no need to convince any adults of anything, really. But there are people that have that evangelical side as atheists. And I think many of them carry that through. They've lost their religion, but they've not lost their zealotry. Since you feel that Friended was strawmanning you, I pose this as a risk of being redundant. Just let me explain the strawman. So, in the video, watch the video. It's worth watching, and it's probably worth reading the comments. Friended gave this example of, he said, well, let's discuss a society with less religion. Now, let's take the example. Let's say we make religion illegal. We ban people from being religious. And then he says, I hope I'm not strawmanning Noel Plum there. I know that's not particularly what he explains. And I made a comment in response saying, well, you are strawmanning me. And the reason you're strawmanning me is not just because because you know that isn't explicitly what I want, but because we discussed this in the Hangout. And I said that functionally that is very, very different to what I'm talking about. And functionally it's very different because it's an absurdity, really. The idea of demanding that people aren't religious, it just doesn't really make sense. So that was why I said he's strawmanning me. I'd already covered that and I'd already dismissed that and said that it was functionally different, and then they gave that as his example. What would be your prediction on a society suddenly without religion? How might we know such a society is better than one which is more religious? How would we know how rational or irrational such a society might be? Would there be any differences between this society and the one you happen to have in England with its gradual loss of religion? Well, so what would be a prediction of a society suddenly without religion? I don't think it's a realistic thing for a start. In terms of societies that have suddenly lost their religion, such as the communist states that have demanded they've been officially atheistic countries, they haven't lost their religion. Just saying, well, we're all atheists in this country is about as amusing as when that Ahmadinejad, the president of Iran, stated that there are no homosexual men in Iran. It didn't make it true, and of course all you effectively do is you suppress these things. So the Russian Orthodox Church quite happily has survived decades of communist rule and oppression. So that doesn't make people lose their religion. And I don't think that's a helpful thing to do. It's an abhorrent thing to do, in fact, and that's certainly not what I would state. But what about if we suddenly make everybody lose their religion? And how would that compare with a gradual loss of religion in the United Kingdom? I think very badly is how it would compare. If you could really do that, let's say I could make a video now, it would have to be a snappier video than this fucking effort, wouldn't it? But let's say I made a video now that was so compelling that anybody who watched it who was religious, for the benefit of Friended, it's appealing to their elephants as well as the riders. It's so compelling that everybody loses their religion. I think it would not be a good thing, actually, because my experience is that people that have, and I did mention this in the Hangout, people that grow up believing in God and for whom religion is a fundamental part of their life really do have a God-shaped hole as a result of that, and they suffer because of that, actually. You know, it's like losing a parent in adulthood. I suppose if you lose your mother and father when you're 6 months old, you never really understand the loss, or you know, if you've never had any brothers or sisters, you don't mourn the fact in the same way as if you get to 25 and then your two brothers get killed in a car crash or something. And people start to rely on the religion and the concept of God, and so it leaves a bit of a hole and often leaves them quite depressed and worried, and so it's not necessarily a good thing, I think. There's also the problem, which is something I've discussed many times, but this is hitting it at a different angle, that a lot of the damage is done because religion drags with it. Religion isn't theism. Religion is theism plus a lot of fucking baggage. And a lot of baggage involves attitudes to lots of other things, like homosexuality and abortion. And I accept that you can still have the same attitudes and not be religious, but it packs a lot of these things together. And when you lose your religion, you don't necessarily lose those perspectives, that you're still wedded to those. And you just justify them by other means. Why? Because as a result of having that religion, you'd already backfilled these religious beliefs. These religious beliefs are taught at a young age, and you centre so much around it that becomes part of your intuitive reasoning, and then you can backfill it with secular arguments as well as religious arguments for all the particulars around things like homosexuality and abortion and sex outside of wedlock and all these different things. So a lot of these quite conservative attitudes then remain and don't necessarily get tackled. Now, I've discussed this before and said that atheist organisations ought to have some empathy and some openness with regard to these things, not take a kind of Captain Andy-esque approach that ultra stupidly naive approach that if you're not online with every single issue at the same time, when you lose your religion, you should just lose all these other views as well, or at least the religious basis for them. And that's absolute bollocks. People just don't work like that. It's just so fucking naive. It's untrue. But there seems to be quite a lot of people in atheist movements that have this sort of approach, and so you're not the right kind of atheist unless, from the minute you lose that aspect, the minute you start seriously questioning and crossing the line into disbelief with your religious belief that all these other things should just disintegrate at the same time, it's so myopic and naive, it's untrue. So a lot of the damage maybe in that way has been done, and I think maybe that people are also more susceptible, perhaps, I don't know, but to the same kind of religious reasoning. If you've accepted that kind of reasoning for several decades, right? Maybe in your teens you've still got the flexibility, but I think as you go on, if you've accepted that kind of reasoning for a large portion of your life, then just because you suddenly start to have doubts in your religion, and let's be honest, it's often over the most spurious things, like, somebody dies in a car crash, or you see a big tragedy, and suddenly you get a little light bulb moment and say, well, surely God wouldn't allow this. Right? As if all the other fucking arguments just washed over you. But now you've actually been faced with something nasty happening to somebody, you start questioning whether God existed or not. Which I've always found kind of mind-boggling, that it can come down to that. Has nothing bad ever happened in the past? Is this the first bad thing that's ever happened? Is that really what it's fucking taken? And sometimes it's things like this that lead people to abandon their religion. And so why would everything else? If effectively, if your reason for abandoning your religion is so irrationally poor and one-dimensional, it's not that it's on its own it's a bad reason, but it's so fucking one-dimensional then why wouldn't some of the other slightly more dodgy and contentious ways of thinking still be present within that individual? In a country like England, things are different. And things are different because the loss of religion is more organic. It's not people losing it's almost entirely not people losing their religion. It's society losing its religion on a generational basis. So people are growing up without it. And you mourn it as much as you mourn the brother or sister that you've never had, that never existed. You don't wonder, well, what am I going to replace religion with? Any more than you wonder, that brother I had that was never born, how am I going to replace him? How am I going to live without having that brother that I've never had? It's just a meaningless, mindless fucking question. Do people funnel their irrationality into other things? Sure, they do. I don't think to the same degree necessarily, although a lot of the religion, understand, a lot of the religion that preceded their parents' religion was a very mild form of Anglicanism and didn't make many demands in terms of irrationality anyway, really. But if you went back 5-10 generations, you'd see a lot more irrationality in terms of the Anglicanism there and in terms of what people believed. So has that over the time been replaced on a one-for-one basis? No. But there is still a residual irrationality that I think gets funneled into other things. Anybody will recognise this within the United Kingdom. Who knows people that are interested, that are marinated in their local football team or a Chelsea, Man United, Man City, whatever, Arsenal. And I have a friend who changed his surname to Gunner because he's an Arsenal fan and they're called the Gunners. That's the kind of thing. He's a good lad, actually, and I'm not accusing him of being particularly irrational, but other than changing his name to Gunner. But people have that irrationality with their football team, and everybody in the UK knows somebody who they won't watch a football game with because they're so biased. Their team can never do any wrong, and the other team can never do any right. Their team is fouled against right, left, and centre, but none of their team ever does anything wrong. And when you speak to them, they may accept that there's some bias, but nevertheless pick it down to any individual decision, and it's the world's fucking against them. You know, you can see, anybody else can see just how fucking irrational they are in the way that they view their team versus everybody else's team. And indeed, a study was done in the United States with fans of American football teams, I think at the college level, that demonstrated exactly this kind of irrationality in part of a scientific study. And it's laughable when it's put in that form. But I think everybody has experienced that. So it still exists, but I don't think it exists in a way that affects society as much. It's a harmless way. It's had the sting extirpated from its arse end in many ways, and it doesn't exist to the same degree as it exists in a much more religious society, which is, again, another point that I made in the comment section, which is it's no just... and in the video, it's not just a case of a religious society versus a non-religious society. Even within different religious traditions, there are different levels of irrationality that are demanded of people, or which leads to different levels of irrationality of its adherents. You know, so functionally, in terms of adult humans, I think it can have a whopping great effect. But yeah, there's a big difference in terms of how you arrive at that, whether it's losing people's religion as adults, if that was as simple as it is to mention, as simple to do as it is to mention, versus the kind of gradualism that's happening in the UK, which is why I'm a proponent of gradualism and pretty much only gradualism. That is the way to replace religion. It isn't to try and force people that, in many cases, depend upon their religious belief. I don't get any pleasure in that. If somebody is really wedded to their religious belief and it's giving them some comfort, I get no pleasure from trying to disabuse them of their religion. And unless they're going to talk about it, if they want to argue with it, well, then hard shit, right? I'm going to argue back. And if it causes them some consternation, some pain, that's hard shit. But other than that, I wouldn't bring the subject up. 2 more questions. I suppose this next one is more general, but what measurement can we use to quantify the quality of a society? Friended seem to highlight cohesion and stability as important factors. Some measure happiness as satisfaction, and still others look at economics and choices, opportunities generally available. What would be on measure, or which measure you think more accurately reflects reality? Okay, I'll just stop the video and start it again, because I'm scared that if something crashes, I've lost about a fucking hour's worth, I think, here. So this is quite an interesting question, I think, and it's one that hasn't cropped up. I've not had the chance to address within this conversation, but it's one that I've given... It's brought me quite a bit of thought on my part, because as this chap, whatever he's called... Ground Floor Guthrie states, Friended has spent a lot of time, he's invested a lot of his intellectual capital in this argument talking about the benefit of social capital and the cohesion, stability, longevity for societies that can lead to, and are they the qualities that we could use to quantify? Are these the quantities that we could use to quantify the quality of a society? I suppose it's amongst them. Others might talk about happiness. Others might talk about freedom. I don't know, and I don't honestly know that I've got to the bottom of that I can give you a metric. Sometimes, rather than coming up with a metric, what we can do is we can look at the conditions, right? The conditions that we'd like to function under. So it's a case of, I can't give you what the answer is, but what I can do is I can give you the kind of conditions upon which we could make a model, the kinds of things that we need to be looking at. It's what Nick Bostrom does in his book Superintelligence, when he talks about the rules that you'd want a super intelligent artificial intelligence that could end up gaining a singularity, that get total control over us, what you would want them to function over. He can't tell you what those ethical rules would be. It might be that you couldn't even write them down, actually. But he can tell you the kinds of things that you would need to be functioning into the model, the things that you would need to be concerned about. And I think that that's something that we often do, right? That's an approach that we quite often take. We know the factors that we would like to see involved, and some of that is what came up in the Hangout, what I brought forward in the Hangout, which is the kind of concerns that I had. So, for example, in the public sphere, I don't necessarily say these are the outcomes that I need to see within the public sphere. These are the things that we need to be doing. You know, we have to allow abortions, we have to allow gay marriage or whatever. These are what I'm more interested in is that when we're having obviously I have my positions on those things, but when we're having those discussions, I would like to be those discussions. For me, what is a good quality for a society is that when we have these discussions, we may dispute the facts. We may dispute which particular basket of facts are relevant, but we will at least see the relevance in each other's basket of facts, right? And this is the problem with religion. Unless everybody subscribes to the same religion, as soon as you have people who are not religious, or even a society with more than one religion, then you've got a bit of a problem where one group of people are going into the public sphere, into the town hall space, and holding the discussion on the basis of, well, these are the facts that I think are important, right? It's like, so with abortion, this is what I think constitutes a human being. This is what constitutes human life versus human life. This is how the brain develops at different numbers of weeks. And these are the ethical concerns we should have as a result, etc. So these are the kinds of things. And then somebody say, well, I don't think the brain development's important necessarily. I think what's important is something like, for example, our ability further down the line to have a sense of self or something like that, right? So you can have these different discussions. But then when the third person comes along and says, well, I think abortion's wrong wholesale because God says so, that's a fucking conversation stopper there. There's no discussion to be had with that. Somebody else comes along, maybe from another religion, this is hypothetical in this case because I don't know that there's a religion that has this position, and says, well, my God actually says that abortion's fine. So it doesn't matter. You can make any arguments against abortion or against reducing the time limit for abortion. It's not going to make any difference. My God says it's fine up until the point of birth. So these are fucking conversation stoppers, aren't they? That they only work if everybody shares the same person. You can't even engage with them. The only way that I can engage in the public sphere with someone there is to start disputing fucking scripture. I've got to pretend almost that I'm a Christian. I've got to play the devil's advocate and say, well, does the scripture say that? Doesn't it say that? Maybe that isn't what your God's trying to tell you. Clearly that's an untenable situation. Right. So for me, I don't know particularly, I don't want to get involved in what are the particular qualities of a society. For me, one of the problems, the frustrations is that to unearth the qualities of societies that we want, we need to be able to have the discussions, and we need to be able to discuss. We might not agree on all the facts. We might all have slightly different baskets of facts, and we might have to have a discussion about that. But at least needs to be, even those baskets of facts need to be compatible to some extent. There needs to be some kind of scientific and rational underpinning to them. If your basket of facts consists of one fact, which is God says no, then there is no discussion that I can have with you, really. And you end up with this situation where effectively, even if we're having a discussion over more secular arguments, it's a fake discussion. You're only making those arguments because you're hoping that they will appeal to me. If they don't appeal to me, if I win that dispute, it's a Mott and Bailey approach that you're taking. You just fall back to your position inwardly. Well, yeah, okay, but I'm still saying no because God says no. You're only making those secular arguments because it gives you a chance of winning me over. But I have no chance of winning you over because those are not the arguments that your position is based upon. It's just a facade. It's a sort of Trojan that you're wheeling in to the intellectual, a Trojan horse that you're wheeling into the intellectual room, while your real little beliefs hide there inside. So that's the problem that I would have, and that's what I would say with regard to that. Maybe that's not a satisfying answer. But those are the important things to me. And as I extrapolated in the Hangout, that impinges on lots and lots of different things. There's lots and lots of areas of the public sphere where that kind of thinking impacts upon me. Right, and it impacts on this next one. This is the last question. My own disdain for Christianity in particular and religion in general is keyed by how much control an institution has over the members of that and possibly outside that institution. The more control exerted, the lower the overall satisfaction and happiness it seems, and the greater my disdain and critique. It seems to me that many who are actively anti-religion religious have much the same perspective. I don't know that it necessarily does make people less happy. It can in some instances, but I don't know that that's always the case. But for me, it's very much not about the control over people who are members of that institution. I'm not saying I don't give a crap about the people who are members of that institution, but that isn't primarily my concern. Primarily my concern, again, it's people who are not members of that institution. I go back again to something that I said in the Hangout, because it was relevant, which is that I understand. I understand that the position of some religious people on abortion, which is that they can't accept this idea. Well, just if your God says abortion's wrong, nobody's forcing you to have an abortion, because it's not as simple as that. If you honestly believe that your God is telling you that it's murder and that is the position and this is a human life, which if you believe that at the point of conception, which is a misnomer because there isn't a point of conception, it can take up to 24 hours, the process of conception. But if during conception embryos are ensouled, right, and that functionally is what makes you a human being, that soul, then I can understand you being frightened by the prospect of abortion and likening that to the same as murdering a 3-year-old child. And if somebody said to me, we're going to pass a law that allows you to murder your own 3-year-old child, it's okay, Jim, you don't have to murder yours, just allow other people to murder theirs, I wouldn't say, oh, that's okay then. As long as I get my choice, they can crack on with whatever they like. So I kind of understand it. And I understand why religious people say, no, I am going to try and impose my religious beliefs on everybody else, right? I believe that it's ethically my duty not just to follow my beliefs myself, but to try and make you fucking live by the same beliefs. Not always the case, because it depends on the nature of the issue. But on certain issues, I understand that. So that makes it, I'm going to say the word, it makes it very problematic, doesn't it? Almost necessarily, inescapably problematic, religion in the public sphere, because it's hard to get away from that line of reasoning in some cases. It's the logical conclusion. And in many ways, those Christians who believe that abortion, that we are ensouled, and that abortion is wrong, but take the principle, I'll turn a blind eye if anybody else does it. In many ways, that's unethical as far as I'm concerned. Because if you really believe what you believe, then you are turning a blind eye effectively to murder. It isn't to me, because I don't believe we're fucking ensouled during conception. I think it's a load of tripe, right? So I have a very different perspective on it. So it's a very, very live question, that one. But it isn't about his disdain is because of the way religious people treat people largely within their own communities. Yeah, that can be an issue at times. Of course it can, especially in very, very harsh religious communities. But for me, it's in the wider public sphere. It's how the religious interact with everybody else. And that's a difficult thing. So from my perspective, as societies lose their religion, and as religion starts to lose its sting, as that sting gets extirpated in the way that it has in many ways with Anglicanism in the United Kingdom, that makes a better environment. Not because of any particular cultural change, you understand, but because we can have those arguments. Those arguments, if a cultural change results, it results as a result of an argument over the facts and over relevant baskets of facts, even if ultimately people are making gut feeling decisions and intuitive decisions. Those are at least based upon growing up in an environment, right, where you can think openly about these things and arrive at something on the basis of what you see, a basis of what makes sense, not on the basis of religious dogma that you're taught, bullshit that you're taught, mistruths that you're taught, that these things are objectively, unquestionably true as a result of it saying so in Scripture. Okay, that's all that I wanted to say. I hope that's answered that. I hope that that's given people something to listen to as they're doing the vacuuming or something like that. Just interested to know what people think about this kind of video as well, because I kind of enjoy just talking a little bit more off the cuff like this. Does lead to a long video, and I certainly wouldn't want to make all my videos like this. It's always going to be a sort of small percentage of videos, but interested to know what people think. Okay, as always, thank you for watching. Bye for now.